The dust of the frontier town seemed to settle into Sam's very bones, a constant reminder of the grit required to survive in the territory. He worked as a male nurse, a medic steward at the St. Jude Infirmary, a weathered wooden structure that smelled perpetually of carbolic acid and pine sawdust. It was a thankless station. While the doctors took the credit and the gold coins, Sam took the night shifts, cleaning wounds, soothing fevers, and holding the hands of those who had no one else. His hands were steady, but his heart had been unsteady for a long time. 3 years prior, Sam had shared a small, drafty cottage with Eleanor. He had loved her with a quiet, fierce devotion, believing that their shared life was enough. But Eleanor was young and weary of the struggle. She grew tired of the threadbare coats and the way Sam's meager wages vanished before the month was halfway through. She wanted the silk gowns she saw in the catalogs from back east. She wanted a carriage that didn't rattle its bolts loose on the mountain passes. The arguments had been sharp, like the crack of a whip. Eleanor's frustration eventually boiled over into a cold departure. She left Sam for Frank, a man whose reputation was as large as his cattle ranch. Frank was a man of silver spurs and heavy purses, promising her a life of luxury in a mansion on the hill. Sam had stood in the doorway of their cottage, watching her trunk being loaded onto a sleek black buggy, his heart fracturing in silence. Despite the sting of her desertion, Sam never sought another companion. He spent his nights at the infirmary and his days in a quiet house that still smelled faintly of her lavender water, anchored by a love that refused to drift away. Time moved differently in the West. Seasons bled into one another through cycles of drought and blizzard. Sam became a fixture of the community, the man who stayed when others moved on to follow the gold veins. He poured his grief into his work, becoming the most compassionate caregiver the town had ever known. One late autumn evening, as the wind howled through the gaps in the infirmary walls, a frantic stagecoach driver arrived. He was carrying a passenger found unconscious at a rest stop miles outside of town. No one knew who she was. Her clothes were tattered, and she carried no identification, only a small empty locket. She was pale, her breathing shallow, and her spirit seemed to be flickering like a candle in a gale. The head doctor glanced at her disheveled state and sighed. "We've no room for charity cases, Sam. If there's no one to pay for the bed and the medicine, she'll have to go to the county poorhouse." Sam looked at the woman's face, obscured by grime and tangled hair, and felt a strange magnetic pull in his chest. "I'll cover it," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "Every cent. Put it against my wages for the next 6 months if you have to. She stays here." For 3 days Sam barely slept. He paid for the finest linens and the most expensive tinctures. He sat by her bedside, bathing her forehead with cool water. It wasn't until the 4th morning, when the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks of the horizon, that the woman finally opened her eyes. Sam was leaning over to adjust her pillow when her gaze met his. The shock hit him with the force of a physical blow. Beneath the exhaustion and the shadows of hardship, the eyes staring back at him belonged to Eleanor. She looked at him, her eyes widening as she recognized the man she had once cast aside. She tried to speak, but her voice was a mere rasp. Sam simply placed a gentle finger to his lips, signaling her to rest. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't demand to know where the silk and the carriages had gone. He simply continued to care for her, providing the medicine he had bought with his own sweat. As she grew stronger over the following week, the story began to emerge in the quiet spaces between her breaths. Eleanor's life with Frank had not been the fairy tale she had envisioned. The wealth she had chased had come at a terrible price. Frank was a man who valued his cattle more than his kin, and his temper was as volatile as a summer storm. He had grown weary of Eleanor's presence when the novelty of her beauty faded, treating her with a coldness that eventually turned into neglect. When a series of bad investments soured Frank's mood, he had simply shuttered his doors to her, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that had no mercy for a woman alone. She had spent months trying to make her way back to the town, ashamed and broken, eventually collapsing from exhaustion before she could reach the gates. One evening, as the orange glow of the sunset filled the ward, Eleanor reached out and took Sam's hand. Her grip was weak, but her touch felt like a bridge being rebuilt. "I don't deserve to be here, Sam," she whispered, tears tracking lines through the pallor of her cheeks. I left you for a shadow. I thought gold was the only thing that could keep a person warm, but I've been cold for 3 years. I am so deeply sorry for the way I treated you, for the things I said, and for leaving you behind. Sam looked at her, and in that moment he realized that his love for her had never been about what she could provide or how she viewed him. It was a constant, like the North Star. He saw the woman she had become, humbled, wiser, and weary of the world's false promises. "The debt is already paid, Eleanor," Sam said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't pay the hospital just to see you get well. I paid because I never stopped looking for you." He didn't bring up Frank again, nor did he dwell on the years of loneliness. He understood that mercy was not about balancing a ledger. It was about opening a door that had long been locked. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's recovery was steady. She began to help Sam in the ward, using her newfound empathy to comfort those who were suffering just as she had been. The townspeople whispered as they always do, but Sam and Eleanor moved through the world with a quiet dignity that silenced the rumors. Eventually, the day came when Eleanor was strong enough to leave the infirmary. Sam walked her out into the crisp mountain air. They stood together on the porch, looking out over the valley where the wildflowers were beginning to succumb to the coming winter. "Where will you go?" Sam asked, though his heart already knew the answer he hoped for. Eleanor turned to him, the light returning to her eyes for the first time in years. "I'd like to go home, Sam. If there is still a place for me in that small cottage, I'd like to spend the rest of my days making it a home again. I don't need the mansion on the hill. I just need the man who stayed." Sam smiled, a genuine warm expression that erased the lines of worry from his face. He reached out and took her hand, leading her down the steps. They walked together, not toward a life of finery or fame, but toward a modest house at the edge of town, a place where the wages were small, but the grace was immeasurable. The past was a ghost that had finally been laid to rest, replaced by the steady rhythmic heartbeat of a love that had survived the harshest of winters.